Hi friend, welcome to the Dream Brave podcast. I'm Waijia. No matter where you're at, God cares about the little and big dreams He's placed in your heart. But what if counting the cost feels too hard? What if what God is calling us into simply feels too costly? I'd love to invite you on a journey with me where I challenge you to dive into scripture, call into remembrance what God has done in your life, to put our faith in a God who's greater than we ever dared imagine. I'll be sharing parts of my journey and interviewing ordinary Christians like you and me with extraordinary faith, which I hope will inspire you to dream brave, even when you feel too small. In the pursuit of your God-given dreams, have you ever felt like the sacrifice you had to make felt too great? Do you ever feel like backing out because the possibility of failure just seems too high? If those are the questions you've asked, this episode is for you. Today, I'm excited to have my ex-boyfriend with me. He's none other than my current husband, Cliff Tam. Cliff is honestly the most inspirational person that I know on earth. And if you've read my book, Dream Brave, or listened to any one of my sermons, you'll see a pattern that Cliff has always been the turning point in my stories through the wisdom God has poured into my life through him. Cliff is a cancer survivor, a liver transplant recipient turned Ironman triathlete. He's a Canadian missionary, a stay-at-home dad, and the founder of the Ordinary Dad Ministry, which ministers to stay-at-home dads in Singapore. And now he's at the brink of leading our family to serving in the mission field in Tanzania. In this episode, Cliff cried at the end of the interview. It was such an emotional one for us, and I hope it will bless you. Cliff, it's great to have you with us.
Hi, Raja. It's good to be talking to you.
Thanks so much, Cliff, for coming on the podcast. I wanted to interview you because I wanted for us to talk about what happens when counting the cost feels too hard. And I know that you've been through so much. You have been through crazy things like the Ironman after a liver transplant, like traveling 10,000 miles to Singapore, even when you weren't sure if we would get married, like serving in Uganda for a year without the mandatory yellow fever vaccine, which you need. And then right now, as a father, leading our family to Tanzania for possibly an indefinite period of time. So tell me, Cliff, or tell us, um, how was this process like for you?
Mm, I would say that when it comes to accounting the costs, this is my third time I really make a major move in my life. My first one is from Canada to Singapore back in 2011. Second time is with you and me going to Uganda in 2014, and now this is the next step, going together as a family to Tanzania. And I think each step is kind of like this. It's almost like giving a bit part of yourself away. Like, like for example, I sold my computer monitor, which I really love because it's a ultra wide screen and I can see two browsers at once, all that stuff. And I love it. And I
Right.
cannot bring that to Tanzania. So what do you do with it?
Mm.
No point leaving it at home. So you gotta sell it. Then I'm like, oh man, I'm losing part of that. And then, and I stopped doing certain things or giving up myself. And I feel like it's just slowly, one part have learning to say goodbye to these things. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. It's when you share that, I think it really, wow, my heart feels heavy because I remember that at every point of the journey, whenever you had to make a big move or something big that you had to do in obedience to God, there was always almost like a laying down, like a surrender. I remember at one point, I can't remember when it was, Cliff, when you had to sell your triathlon bike. Perhaps it was when we were going to Uganda. And I remember, wow, like even when you came home to tell me it was sold, it was bittersweet. Like you were so happy and relieved, but also I was so sad.
Mm.
So how has this experience of giving up things or saying goodbye like affected you? How hard has it been?
Mm. It's interesting you say that. For me, the like of my experience of transition or giving things up for God, right? To follow
Mm.
God. I think for me the one there's one memory I can remember is when I make the move from Canada to Singapore and I went to the phone store and I canceled my phone number.
Wow.
because I don't need it no more, right? What's the point of me keeping it? And whether you're using WhatsApp or how people communicate to you, right? Your phone number is actually part of your identity, right? Because
Yes.
it's unique to you and you use it all the time. And without it, no one can contact you. You cannot live without it. And
Yeah.
so, and that I remember when I left the phone store and I canceled my phone and number, I was like, wow, this is pretty serious, right?
Mm.
Pretty serious because the life that you know of is no longer to be there.
Wow. It's interesting, isn't it, how certain things or actions or even people and places that we leave behind has such a profound impact on us. I remember when you sold your monitor screen, like it was such a huge thing for you and it was so unexpected because I didn't realize how affected you would be. And then yet last night, when I was trying to sort out what books do I want to bring to Tanzania and what books do I want to leave behind, like I couldn't help but hold back tears. And I remember, our children, they wanted to bring their comic books so badly. And I actually gave them an ultimatum like a couple of weeks ago and told them out of the 12, the set of 12, you can only bring two. And of course, they didn't argue. I mean, they're good girls. Of course, they were hoping so much to bring them all, but when I realized that I had to leave my books behind and my tears welled up, last night I actually took out all their comic books and I told them, you know what? Why don't you just have them for as long as you need to, and let's see where the Lord brings us with this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not easy. I think, I think I shared with you after I sold my monitor. I mean, I'm a geeky guy, right? So, so it just feels like, oh, I'm cutting part of my body off because I used it, when I was writing my thesis. That was so helpful, and so of course, can I live without this monitor? Of course, I can. Anyone can,
Mhm.
but it's just you use it so much that it's almost not to say it's part of you, but it becomes of part of your identity, right? Because you can always
Yeah.
rely on it. And I think it really kind of brings back to what it means to follow Jesus. Not that we had to
Yeah.
forcefully give up everything and live our minimal life, but I think
Mm.
there are times when, he asks us to give things up for to follow him. Or maybe another way to look at it, it makes sense to give it up to follow him. So for example, like I said before, right? Like rationally, it wouldn't make sense for me to drag this huge monitor to Tanzania because I cannot even
Mhm.
pack it. But it makes sense to give it or sell it or whatever because I'm not gonna just let it collect dust, in a room. Why not just, get rid of it, sell it, use it, give it to someone else, right? That makes
Yeah.
sense to me. Yeah.
Wow. That's so interesting that, but now we're talking about leaving things behind, like the grief of leaving things that are precious to us. But what other costs have you had to count? What other things have you had to do? Because not everybody might be like us, moving cross culturally or cross continentally. But yet, God has been calling people to embark on a new adventure or embark on something that costs them something. What are some of these other intangible costs, so to speak, that you've had to give up or lay down?
Okay, I think one that is whole very dear to me is having medical healthcare. So I had
Oh
a liver
yeah.
transplant when I was 10 in Canada.
Mhm.
And if you live in Canada, you're a Canadian citizen, you have free medical healthcare. So whenever I have any liver issues, I can go to the hospital, don't have to pay a bill, and they'll be fine. So when I came to Singapore or when I went to go to Africa, because of my liver transplant, no medical insurance company will take me in as a client for medical insurance
Right.
because they consider
Right.
high risk. And so that become a weighty matter, right? Because
Of
of course
course.
medical bills can be very expensive. And so,
Yeah.
especially with me having a liver transplant, it becomes this decision that you need to make. Like, is and I think you and I have this conversation many times through our marriage.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that I feel like we come to a decision is that we shouldn't let the medical coverage to dictate how we live
Wow.
because we should follow Jesus first, right? And then he provides for us. So
Wow.
so that means that if there are times when the medical coverage is not there, okay, because I still gonna follow Jesus first, and then the other stuff comes in second or third or fourth.
Wow, I love what you're saying, Cliff, because what you're actually saying is that you value obedience to God over safety. And that's something I've always personally admired because I think you've had a much more courageous approach when it comes to your healthcare. For some reason, even before we met, even before we got married, I think I've always struggled with your health, always worried, always wondering, what if Cliff doesn't have health insurance now that, you can't have an evacuation plan covered by insurance either. What if this happens? What if that happens? And do you remember, Cliff, when we were in Canada? That was after I had done my Masters of Public Health in the States, and we had just had 2 children, and somebody actually had provided a home for us in Canada, and we actually were wondering whether or not to move back to Singapore. And we knew in our hearts that God wanted us to because I had a compulsory bond to serve with the government as a medical doctor. Remember that? And I remember both of us got off the call with the Canadian kind of health insurance government kind of service. And they actually informed us that due to certain like residency requirements and all that, that you would lose your health care coverage, that welfare, so to speak, by the government. And I remember both of us just looking at each other, realizing that, wow, we have like no more safety net anymore. And yet, all these years, God has been preserving your health. He has been providing you like wonderful doctors in Singapore who have been so kind even to waive their consultation fees for you. And so, even as we make the move to Tanzania, I think I'm just reminded that as much as God has sustained you for 44 years, that I should start to trust Him for the next 44 years, of your life.
Yeah, that's a very good comment, which I think even for
Mm,
me, I often like sometimes I get worried like, oh man, how long can this liver last? This liver transplant
right.
is very long. It's like 33 years now since I had it, or
Yeah.
34 years.
Mhm.
That's a long time.
Right.
And but I think something that the safety net we should be seeking is actually
Yeah.
God Himself. Now I'm not
Mm,
saying that like if for example if I'm able to get insurance, I will get it because it's just a wise
right.
thing to do, right? So I'm not telling
Mm,
people don't get insurance and just but I have come to a point where like, okay, God, I think you are my safety net, and
wow.
I would trust in you because I have, well, in my circumstances, I have nowhere else to turn to. And I think that's what I think Tim Keller says something along this line of you don't know how much you need Jesus or how valuable Jesus is when he's the only thing you got. And I think I have
Wow. That is
right.
so good.
Yeah. I remember that time when we went to, when the government, my Canadian government or the ministry denied me of having my
Mm,
medical coverage, and
yeah.
I remember like, and we're like, okay, figure out, okay, should we say this? Should we do this? Should we, stay in Canada longer? And then, and I think, when that happens, I think God, really just give me that nudge to say, you know what, can you trust me more beyond the Canadian healthcare? Can you trust me to provide for you? Right?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so good, Cliff, because I remember even before we went to Uganda, like I had really had to grapple with the fact that you couldn't take the yellow fever vaccination, and that's mandatory for entry because yellow fever is such a risk in Uganda where we would be serving for at least a year. And I remember we went for that recce trip. It was a 10-day recce trip for us to also explore to see what kind of healthcare access they had for you. Do you remember we went to this big hospital and I was trying so hard to find a hepatology department for you? And the funny thing was, I thought God would deliver us. I thought God's grace would cover us by providing a hepatologist. I was so much into, God delivering us that way. I had a certain fixated idea of how God would come through. And I was so disappointed. I remember when they said we don't have a hepatologist, there's no hepatology department, when I realized how little support that hospital could provide. I went out the door feeling so despondent. And I don't know if you actually remember that moment, but as we walked out, there was this tall black African man with this white coat. And it was so bizarre. He just came over and stopped me and said, you know, you look lost, which is like Ugandan speak for, can I help you, right? Do you remember that
Yes.
moment?
Yes, I remember.
And then he said that, you know, based on what he had heard about us, that he wanted to give me his name card. And he said, I'm actually the medical director of this entire hospital. And I'm going to give you my personal cell phone number. So if anything, even like just a little fever for your husband and you're worried, and if you ever need to arrange for evacuation of any sort, please contact me directly. My number is up 24/7. And at that point in time, I just felt overwhelmed by the Holy Spirit because before we got married, I think the first year, I had panic attacks on a regular basis, like waking up in the middle of the night in cold. So worried that something would happen to you, worried that that you know going to Uganda was such a bad idea, especially because just soon after we got together, your liver numbers really spiked high, and you know there was this incident where you weren't sure whether your transplant was gonna last you much longer. And all that was kind of traumatic for me. You're smiling right now, but it was very traumatic for me. And that incident just makes me realize that, wow, God's really got your back. God's got us
Hmm.
in his palm. Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel that way, Cliff? Like how has God been assuring you with regards to this idea of him having your back?
Hmm. I think I would think that okay, now that I'm older, now I turned 44 like 2 weeks ago. I think something that I continue to remind myself is that it is actually a miracle. Or I mean, God sustained every moment of our lives. From us
Yeah.
getting up in the morning, for us able to breathe, for us able to be awake. Every moment, like, is actually a miracle because something can happen and you never know what will happen. Not to scare everybody, but I think just the reality. The reality is that, that I cannot even able to like it's like what you said, right? Like you don't even know what tomorrow will bring because I can have no control.
Mm,
I have no control of that. And so I need to rest on what Jesus said, right? That my heavenly Father knows my needs more than me. I have a father who has sustained me, my heavenly Father who sustained me my whole life. And I think I need to rest on that because if not, you will freak out or you like, be very, do the opposite, right? Like discipline everything, try to be as healthy as you can, try to do everything you can and living actually living out of fear, right? And
yeah.
I think, yeah, but I would say that I think the part about the yellow fever vaccination is a good thing you mentioned that because on one hand, I can be like, just be, okay, just God, trust in God and don't worry about it. We did worry. We did count the cost about me dying because if I have a yellow fever, it's highly fatal and it attacks the liver, right? So, and I don't have the vaccination. So it's, you know, and I'm considered high risk. But remember, we did talk about it. And then how God opened those doors is that we find like your a professor doctor who knows you, but you didn't tell her that and she is because she was actually the expert in the yellow
Yellow
fever,
fever
yeah,
vaccination.
for WHO. And it just happened in Singapore, so
Yeah.
happened to know you, so happened to heard about me, so happened to ask me to come in, so happened to write me an exemption letter. Like so for me, it's like God opened those doors, right?
Mm,
Like and so we're not functioning out of pride, just to like blindly go in and say, oh, okay, I don't, I don't do my due diligence, I just go in, but rather we did prepare the cost and we did consider,
mm.
right? And God opened those doors.
Wow. I love that you mentioned that. I actually almost forgot about it because I think what you're sharing with us is the principle of wisdom,
Yes,
in that we're not just going in like a foolhardy rush, just to fulfill some sort of like a bravado that we
yes,
have for ourselves or anything, but rather we really just laid it before the Lord. In fact, when I met that the World Health Organization specialist in yellow fever vaccination, I was actually hoping she would turn us away and say that you shouldn't go to Uganda. That was actually my hope. But instead, I remember we went into that meeting with the doctor telling God that, Lord, whatever you lead, we will follow. So we really went in with open palms, open sweaty palms, at least for me.
Yes, yeah.
but but when the doctor actually checked out the exact location we were at, and she said that, the risk is actually not as high as we think. And when she said she would write an exemption letter for us because of your condition, then it was as if God was saying, you can take the next step forward. So I think when it comes to counting the cost, something valuable I have learned in our journey and also from you is that on one hand, not to live with the idea of safety as top priority, because our idea of safety is so different from God's idea of safety. His idea of safety is obedience. And so, like rightly, when you said that if you put your liver transplant on the top of the list all the time, then we would be living out of fear. And the second thing I learned from you was also wisdom, in that it's not about just doing the foolhardy thing, but it's about being wise. You did explore insurance, you did do your due diligence, but outside of that, then all we can do is to trust the Lord,
Yes. Yeah.
right?
So I think
Right.
there's a balance, because I think
Mm,
sometimes in the Christian community, there's extremes, right? There's one side who is like, you know, everything is safety, safety first. Everyone must be safe. If it's not safe, I won't go do anything. Then you won't do anything for the Lord, because following Jesus, there's risk. Just look at all the disciples who follow him and died. And then there's the other extreme saying that, go blindly, almost like a Peter, like just go in without thinking through all this stuff and just, okay, just trust in the Lord. But I think for you and I don't think we're better, but I think we're in the middle where we know that risk, we know that cost, and we count the cost and we make the preparation, right? Whether it's getting a vaccine, whether getting medical insurance, whether preparing ourselves, we're not foolhardy into just blindly trust, okay, well, whatever happens, God will provide, right? Like even, for example, preparing our will, like, finding guardians for our kids. On one hand, you can say, well, God can provide, God always provides. Yes, they do, but it's also our responsibility as parents to prepare what happened next, just in case you and me see Jesus and my kids are still on earth, right? And
yeah.
so there's that, I won't say a balance, but there's that, I don't want to say equilibrium, but there's that two sides that we need to,
Hold
yeah, whole
intention.
intention. And I don't think they're polar opposites. So I think the wisdom lies in, where do you do your due diligence and where do you have faith in God? And I think that
Mm.
is the key, actually. Yeah.
I love that. I love that you mentioned the principles of doing due diligence, like going 100% all out to make sure that we understand the place, we understand the risks, and yet also that 100% surrender to say, God, at the end of the day, I've counted the cost, I know the risks, and yet I'm still following you. I like what you mentioned, Cliff, about this whole will thing, because I think we've had a very sobering month, with your birthday. And, it's so funny. Cliff actually requested to sign our wills on the exact day of his birthday. And it was such a heavy moment for me because you had to read through things like who is our guardians in the event that both of us die. And we've had friends who are missionaries and who have passed on in the field. They left their children behind. And we also have another friend who's a missionary, and his child died during evacuation out of the country. And so these scenarios are very real for us. And Cliff, I'm interested to know, what are your thoughts about why is it so important to count the costs? Because this whole idea of having to do your wills, thinking of the worst case scenario, having to prepare your so-called your advanced medical directive, all these are very unpleasant things. And honestly, I think a lot of people our age have kept putting it off. Like, I would not have embarked on this until we had to go to Tanzania. It was like a real push for me because it's so unpleasant to think about. But why is it so important to think of all these worst case scenarios? Like, what's the point of it all?
Wow, that's a really good question.
Mm.
I think for me, doing all this stuff is part of preparing ourselves to go to Tanzania. And I think we're trying to live simply, and we're trying to, in order to do that, we gotta see what is important, what is not. And I think that
Right.
is part of counting the cost of following Jesus. Counting the cost of following Jesus is really laying down like what is important to you, and versus what do we need to follow Jesus. Okay. So for example, what's important to me? I call myself a triathlete. I like to ride my bike. I like to swim. I like to run. Those are important to me. But when we go to Tanzania, I'm not going to ride a bike because it's dangerous, right? I'm not going to bring my road bike there to ride because it's very dangerous, right? And I'm,
Mm.
so I'm laying those stuff down because going to Tanzania, my mindset is that I'm going to do what God calls me to do. And the first year we're going to learn is how to settle down and get everybody adjusted to living in Tanzania. So that is my focus. So my cost is giving up what I like to do, right? And even for example like healthcare, right? Giving that up
Mm.
because there's no one can bring the whole thing over. It doesn't make sense anyways.
Right.
And so those are stuff that, for me, those stuff makes sense from a logical standpoint.
Right.
Like that's how now I use my logical mind to say, okay, what do I need to do to get there? And these are the steps that I need to do. The cost of it is kind of, you know, yeah.
So are you saying that counting the cost actually helps you sharpen your focus as to what God is calling you to do?
I think kind of the cost shows me to myself what do I value the most. Right. If
Wow.
I say I value following Jesus, and if I believe Jesus is calling us as a family to go to Tanzania, then the steps I'm doing right now, these little courses are something that big, is actually showing to myself that am I really believe what I'm saying? Or am I really believing what I say I believe? Or am I just saying
Yes.
it
Yes.
because everybody say it at church or I read it
Yeah.
as a good statement? Right. But when I'm
Mm.
actually doing these steps, right, whether I'm signing my will away and looking at like medical application for you guys, or even prepare the work permits application and selling out all the stuff that I have. But those are the steps I can say, you know what, I'm following Jesus. Now I'm not saying
I understand.
I'm not saying that like you have to do that to follow Jesus, but I say that these steps shows me that I'm making the conscious decision of following Jesus. Yeah.
I really love that, Cliff, because I think many listeners who are listening in right now, they might be struggling not with, necessarily a cross-continental move, which is not at all very common, but they might be struggling with, for example, taking a big step forward to follow what God is calling them to do. And I think what you're saying is that counting the cost actually helps us to distill what is really important to us. And it makes us come face to face with the fact that perhaps if what we need to do feels too hard for us, then we need to be honest with ourselves that perhaps we're not treasuring Christ as much as we ought to, right?
Yeah. And I actually think when you count the cost or when you lay the cost down or surrender,
Mm.
that actually build up your faith.
True?
Like it has this effect because I remember like when I saw everything I have in Canada, that period where I'm just like, clearing out my room, clear everything out. Like I know why I'm doing it. And I know and that is my cost. And so that
Absolutely.
built up my faith. So the same thing where we pack our stuff to go to Uganda. I know my faith where I'm putting my faith in.
That is so good.
And then when in this period when we're doing like making this transition to Tanzania when we're packing our so many suitcases, I know why are we doing what we're doing because
Yeah.
and so I think counting the costs or even giving how I say even the sacrifice of the cost of giving into the cost,
Yeah.
it builds up faith. It builds up that faith of you are who you say you are. And if I say I'm a disciple of Jesus, then this is my action that reveals it. Yeah.
Wow. I'm going to read at this point Luke 14 because I think what you're sharing is so apt for that. It's Luke 14, verse 25, and it says, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, then everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. And then it ends off in verse 33 by saying, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Wow. And it reminds me of, I think this whole journey, you're right, Cliff, like just us needing to distill what we want to pack and what we don't want to pack, that itself is really a spiritual exercise because it reveals to us what we truly treasure, I think. Right. And maybe right now, what I'm curious to ask also is, you've taken great risks when you were single, like doing the Ironman, even, moving all the way from Canada to Singapore, going to Uganda when you were married. But now you have children. Now you're a dad. How has that changed your process of counting the cost? Like, I know recently, we've faced criticism, and it has been quite discouraging at times when people come to us saying, or implying that we don't care about our children's education or we don't care about their future. How do you process this? And how does the process of counting the cost look like?
I think it's interesting because I think when I was 7 or 8, my family migrated from Hong Kong to Canada. Okay,
Yeah.
so that is two different countries, very different systems. But my parents do it for my sake, me and my sister's sake, right? And so I can see the parallel of that is that now my child is 7 and 5, and we're making a move from Singapore to Tanzania. The difference is, this is the hard part. The difference is, I do see that, from a worldly view, you're not moving up, right? People tend to migrate from one country to another is to move up to serve a better life, better opportunity, better jobs, better standard of living.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we're doing that. But I do think that I don't think we are. I don't think we're doing too much of a disservice for our kids in the sense that we think if they stay in Singapore, or most people think they'll be fine, they'll be happy, they have, it's good for them, good their future. But I would say that, even in Singapore, kids grew up have problems to deal with. I'll just say for one, mental problems, right? And so no one can guarantee me that even my kids are Singapore, they will have them, like they will all be all right,
Yes.
right? So I think there's this idea that, oh, we don't think about our kids' future or education because we're moving them to Tanzania. I would say not necessarily so, because I think you can give them a life that they don't see differently. But more importantly, it's not just about that. It's more about, are we able to, okay, my desire is for them to be able to see God move in our whole family, and that they will experience that too, and that they will
Wow.
want to follow Jesus because Jesus provides for me just as Jesus provides for them.
It's true.
And I think when we're in Tanzania, okay, I'm sure it's really hard for them. Like the friends they have here, they don't have it there, and in Singapore and so on.
And water carts and power carts and
No water cut, power cuts,
no
but
shopping
those things
malls.
shouldn't, like, I mean, I'm not saying they're not important, but this issue is so important, right?
Right. They shouldn't rule our lives, right? That's what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think I would say in a strange way, maybe Tanzania won't be so bad for them because, I mean, in Singapore, even in Canada, or other countries, like most kids, our kids' age, they just stick in front of a gadget all day long.
Mm. It's interesting that you say that, Cliff, because I think what you're saying is, on the other hand, there are these very significant risks or downsides. For example, moving to a developing country, there are power cuts, water cuts. There's a lot of instability. Life is very fragile there. There are no seat belts on like public transport. Everything there feels very fragile. Even the healthcare system, the access to even things that are so basic here are not available there. Things like even some kinds of stationery or even toy shops, they're not readily available. There's no like bookstore where you can get assessment books or just the things that we take for granted here. And yet you're saying that, you know, the situation, the reality may not actually be as dire as we imagine it would. And yet, on the other hand, I remember many late night conversations that we've had where we do imagine those situations to be as dire. And I think maybe that's the journey of counting the cost. It's actually being prepared for the worst case scenario. And for me, I know I remember asking you, like, why is it important for you? And for you, you mentioned it's because it helps you distill and sharpen your focus. And for me, actually, it's a little bit similar but different in that I need to count the cost. I need to imagine the worst case scenarios because when those scenarios happen, I don't want to up and go and leave my faith and leave my God because I say, God, this is not what I signed up for. I want to be able to be in those situations and say, God, even in this time, I will choose to praise you no matter how hard it is. And one of the hardest things I think I'm still having trouble totally immersing myself and envisioning is, what if it's harder than we thought? What if it's worse than we expected? What if we go through trauma together? What if we lose one of our family members out of the four of us, right? What if our children leave the faith because they couldn't understand why we had to put them through this? And yet, I remember there was one day, I think just recently, it was last week, I was so troubled by so many of these thoughts. And I was talking to you in the kitchen, and you just asked me, what if, Waijia? What if? What if God came through? What if it worked? And it just occurred to me that so often when I look back at our lives, God made the impossible work, Cliff. Like, you weren't supposed to survive that huge liver cancer, and yet somebody died and his liver was given to you. I mean, nobody knew if you were going to get married, have kids, do an Ironman, and all that happened. Nobody knew if any of these things would come to pass, and yet God made it happen. And so I remember that week when we signed our wills together, I was so heavy hearted. I remember I made this mistake. It was a parenting mistake, actually. When the kids were young, sometimes we would mention to them, we would go to the field, and then, in the event that dad and mom, something bad happens, that we would have someone fly in to take them out, right? And we remember having this conversation. But now that our kids are older, I made this huge parenting boo boo because I just talked about it again, like so casually, as if like they were kids, and they would joke about it and laugh. And this time they bawled because they were old enough to understand, like, oh my goodness, like, I don't want to be left alone without my parents in a foreign country. And they just completely bawled. And God yet was still so good. That week, even though I felt so down, I remember receiving a text, or a box, actually. I received a box. We received a parcel, right, from this Instagram follower. Do you remember, Cliff? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was the box with a stack of books inside, and one of the books was called What If? The what if monsters, right? All these what if monsters plaguing our children. And there are good what if critters, and these little good what if rainbow critters would tell the kid, what if things turned out well? What if things were good? And that book uplifted not only me, but the kids so much. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I think thank you for sharing, Rachel. I think we got to look at our lives, at least for you and me. Like for me, I always look at it through the eyes of the Great Commission,
Mm.
right? I look at it from, Matthew 6, I think 6:32. Seek the kingdom first, and all shall be given to you, right? Sorry, let me pull the
That's Matthew 6:33.
6:33, right?
Seek
Because
first
I think
the
those
kingdom of God,
those are
and
the
all these
first
things will be
step.
added to you.
Yeah, and all these things are like, what should you eat, what should you, just your basic necessities, right?
Yeah.
And I think we need to, for me, those are the key passages where my life follows. They're the key direction where my life will make those decisions.
Wow.
And when these decisions are that we make, right, like the cost of it is just part of, like I said, it's part of the game. Like when I was training for an okay when back when I first wanted to do an Ironman, very naive, that I didn't know how long it is. I don't know how to swim, don't know how to run, don't know how to bike, don't know any of these things, right? But I grasp the cost I need to do. The cost of it is, for example, on Friday night when I feel, I was like 20 back then, mid 20s, everybody goes out, right? All my friends will go out and have fun and whatnot. Guess what? 9 o'clock, I go to sleep because I gotta get up at 6 or 5 in the morning or 5:30 in the morning so that I can, go for like these like 5 hour, 6 hour bike rides because I need to train my body to do and to endure, right? So those are that is a cost I understand. Like on Friday, I will not see my friends. Saturday, I won't see my friends. Sunday, the whole weekend, I disappear because I need to train. That's the cost I know I need to put it down to do the Ironman. Now, can I do an Ironman without it? Yeah, I probably so, but there'll be some cost involved, and so from my experience from prepare myself to do the Ironman, give me a lot of in my mind a lot of experience of what it means to count the cost and press in 100%.
Wow.
And so that become the, in a strange way, that become my spiritual
Blueprint.
guidance, yeah, blueprint
Yeah.
for when I am doing these transitions. Like, why do I have to give everything up? Because it makes sense. Because also what Jesus said,
I love how you bring that perspective because for me, I count the cost because I want to know the worst case scenario, right? And not leave Jesus. But then for you, I feel like it's a very good compliment, like to remind me that, hey, you count the cost not just to look at the worst case scenario, you count the cost to look forward. You count the cost to look towards the cross because of what Jesus has done for us, what he's propelling us to do. And that's the Great Commission. And that's worth giving up everything for because he gave up everything for us.
Yes, yeah. So I think, yeah, thank you for sharing, Richard. I think that's kind of what I was trying to say, going to say to the next point is that we count the cost and we give up everything because Christ does the same for us, or did the same for us by dying on the cross.
Wow.
So if he counted the cost and he did the same for us, our response for worship is actually the same. And he said
Wow.
that. He said it so clearly, right? He said that, you must take up a cross and follow me, right?
Yes.
So he said it very clearly. And so this is why we do what we do.
Wow.
And from the world perspective, it doesn't make sense. You're right. Like from the world perspective, it's like I'm putting myself in danger, you in danger, the kids in danger. Why are we doing all that? Stay in Singapore, nice and safe, or Canada, nice and safe. But from a spiritual perspective, this makes so much sense. So much
Wow.
sense. From a
And
Great Commission perspective, that makes
yeah,
sense.
thank you so much, Cliff. That was so good. I want to bring our episode to a landing point, and I like to end my podcast with like some questions that I ask every guest. So the first one is there a book you'd recommend our listeners with regards to, counting the cost or dreaming bravely for God?
Yes, for me, like all this idea of cost and dying to yourself, part of that is actually from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So he wrote this book called The Cost of Discipleship. And there's like one line I always remember. It says that when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die.
Wow.
And so like this process of us going to it's Tanzania or Uganda or me coming to Singapore, that makes sense to me because
Mhm.
Christ the times will call us to come and die,
Wow.
surrender yourself and follow me. And I
Wow.
think and I think for me that is our huge inspiration
Mm.
or aspiration
Right.
to do what we're doing. For me that
Mm.
makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Cliff. The second question I have for you is for someone who's afraid to count the cost, someone who's afraid to dream brave, what is something you would encourage him or her with?
I think for me, what can how I can encourage that someone is to reflect on what God has given you.
Mm.
Like I think for me, what touches me the most is God has given me this long to live, and I think for me, I have what we say despite my operation and whatnot, I will say I live a very I would say normal, but very healthy
Mm.
life.
Mm.
And I'm so thankful,
Wow.
just to be able to get up and have no pain. And
Mm.
so I think when I realized that I am so in awe and thankful for what God has done for me, so this gives me that courage and faith to say, you know what, I will give this up for you, even if it hurts,
Wow.
because you are worth it. God, you are worth it.
Wow.
I will
Thank
do
you,
that.
Cliff. That's so inspirational because I think, well, not all of us have a liver transplant for sure, but I think this is one of the attitudes that you carry that I personally find very inspiring is that you cherish what you have so much to the point where everything that you do is just such an act of gratitude. And I think all of us can learn from that in whatever state of health that we are in to just realize that it's not about how much or little that we have to give is that God has given to us a life to live. And with that, we can serve Him somehow, some way out of our comfort zones, right? So thank you for that, Cliff. And the last one is would you complete this sentence for me? Dream brave because.
Because Jesus laid down his life for me.
Wow, that's so good.
Yeah.
That is so good. Wow, Cliff. Thank you so much for coming on the Dream Brave podcast. We've just been so blessed by your honesty. And I just want to say that, Cliff and I, we didn't like prepare the interview question and answers. And these were all questions I genuinely wanted to ask you, Cliff. So thank you so much for sharing with us your wisdom. I'm so thankful. I'm thankful to be married to you.
Me too, Jeff. Me too.
So thank you so much, Cliff. All right, it's
Thank
a
you.
wrap.
Okay. Take care. Have a good day, everybody. Bye bye. God bless.
Friend, I hope this conversation with Cliff about counting the cost blessed you. If you know an ordinary Christian with extraordinary faith whom you'd love to hear me interview, or if that person's you, please let me know. Just drop me a note at hello@kitedreams.org. Have a wonderful week.